What is microscopic, necessary to make wine, and found all over and even in the foods we eat? If you guessed yeast, then you guessed correctly. And today we are talking about this little fungi that makes our favorite beverage a possibility. Hi there, I'm Jacqueline for Vero, where we go around the world to discover wild and scarce small production wines to bring to the US for consumers, businesses, and distributors in nearly every state. So, knowing that all of this good wine that we search out is thanks to yeast, we thought it might be worthwhile to find out what the heck it is. Alright, so yeasts are single-cell fungi discovered by Louis Pasteur. There are thousands of different species, some good and some bad. We are interested here in the good ones, those that will actually help transform our foods and drinks, and not the bad ones that will cause infections. Now, these good yeasts can complete something called fermentation. This is where good yeasts will eat sugar or carbohydrates, and the byproduct of this will mainly be three things: alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat. This is how winemakers will take grape juice and turn it into wine. The yeast will eat the sugar in the grape juice and produce alcohol. But this is actually a process that goes on in a lot of foods. For example, bread and other bread products like pizza will have yeast in them as well. There is too a whole new host of beverages hitting the market that work with fermentation and are being promoted as health-oriented, like probiotic kombuchas. And of course, we cannot forget beer production, which also relies upon yeast for that fermentation process as well. So really, yeast is everywhere we look. But we are here to talk about wine. So we're going to zoom in on yeast in winemaking specifically. The yeast that is used to ferment grape juice can come from one of two places: added yeasts or natural yeasts, also called native or indigenous yeasts. Added yeasts are strains that are bred specifically for winemaking, and some can even be designed for specific grapes, because the yeasts can actually have quite an impact on the final product of wine in terms of flavor, profile, and aroma. So a lot of companies that sell commercial yeasts will try and identify those strains that give the most typical characteristics of certain grapes. Native yeasts, on the other hand, will come from the vineyards themselves. They are found on the grape skins in a sort of dusty film that will coat the grape, called a bloom. They can also come in contact with machinery in the vineyard and hitch a ride into the winery itself. These yeasts, when washed off the grape skins during pressing, will then be present in the air and surfaces all over the winery as well, and act as natural activators for the fermentation, starting it spontaneously. Now, there are lots of pros and cons to which type of yeast-based fermentation a winemaker will want to use, so we're going to break each down and look at them. First, added yeast, also called inoculation. These wines will have the benefit of being consistent. A winemaker can ensure that they use the same strain of yeast year after year after year, and they will therefore be sure that the wine will ferment properly with no worries, and that the yeast will impart the same flavors and aromas, ensuring that year after year they have a stable and consistent product on the shelves. The cons of this are that they are wiping out those natural yeasts that are found in the vineyard and on the grape, meaning that a large part of the place and the terroir of the wine is actually removed and being replaced by these generic yeast strains. So now let's talk about the native yeasts. There are studies that show individual vineyards can have distinct, let's say, biomes of yeast, and that they can vary a lot from place to place, not over just large distances, like take a vineyard from Piedmont and a vineyard from Burgundy, but also within the smaller regions themselves. This leads us to the largest pro of using native yeasts. They can represent that individual place and terroir in a way that commercial yeasts cannot. They can produce aromas and flavors that are unique to the vineyard, unique to that grape, and unique to that wine. They will give you a sense of where it comes from. There are also a lot of somms that will believe these native yeasts can produce a more integrated and balanced aroma and flavor profile, as they help the wine express itself as the natural grape intended. This opinion extends as well into food pairing, where a lot of pairings can be made based on tradition, or foods that come from the same place being paired with wines from that place. The native yeast will enhance those local flavors in food and wine for better pairings. And before we jump into the negatives, I want to talk a little bit about a gray area, or a side effect of native yeasts that's not really a pro or a con. It's this idea of consistency. So just like with commercial yeasts, a winemaker can control the final product and be sure of the result of those selected yeasts. With native yeasts, they don't have that same control. While it's true true that, especially after many years of spontaneous fermentation, vineyards and wineries can develop specific biomes of yeasts. This is something we will talk about in a second, and there really isn't a total guarantee of which of the thousands of yeasts present in a vineyard or on a grape berry will be the one that takes off and sparks fermentation. This means that there might be slight variations in the spontaneous fermentation year to year in terms of what the final aroma and flavors are. So if you're looking for a shelf-stable commercial wine, this is a bad thing, to have every vintage be different. However, if you are like us and you embrace these vintage variations, it can actually be not only a good thing, but a bonus. Now the cons. Just like native yeasts can cause vintage variations, in some cases, if a winemaker is not careful, yeasts can take effect that will cause malodorous smells, and they might force a winemaker to have to undergo a heavy interventional course correction. However, as we mentioned earlier, with years of spontaneous ferments, this becomes less and less likely thanks to natural selection of the yeasts present, which leads us to another con, that using native yeasts or relying upon spontaneous fermentation might not just always be possible for a winery. As we mentioned, yeasts will come into the winery on harvesting equipment and on the grapes themselves. This will cause them to kind of breed inside the winery, spreading and proliferating year after year. In newly constructed wineries or wineries that are newly founded, there aren't these hitchhiking yeasts already present. This means that spontaneous fermentation will struggle and, in most cases, not even happen in the beginning. It might take a few years for a winery to be able to do spontaneous fermentation. As well, a lot of commercial yeasts are bred specifically to ferment a wine completely to dryness. This is because some yeasts are not able to live with alcohol levels above a certain level. In this case, a native yeast might not be strong enough to ferment a wine to dryness. When, for example, rising climactic temperatures can cause a grape to overripen and produce a lot of extra sugar. This will cause also a subsequent rise in alcohol, which will kill the natural yeast before all of the sugar has been fermented, leaving us with a sweet wine that might not be desirable. In this case, a winemaker might be forced to add commercial yeasts just to restart the fermenting and finish off the extra sugars. And on one final note about yeast. Have you ever had a bottle of Pet Nat or looked at a bottle of champagne before it's been disgorged? You might see a sediment that is clouding the wine. These are actually the yeasts. Called lees at this point, some wines will actually age for a very long period of time in contact with these lees before they're filtered and bottled. This will give a wine more complexity and also impart interesting aromas and flavors that are derived from the yeast, like bready aromas or pastry-like aromas. Next time you're tasting a wine that's been aged on the lees, try to see if you can find those aromas. There is really so much about yeasts. They are such a crucial part to wine, we could go on forever. In fact, in the coming weeks, we are going to be releasing a full article on the subject on the Vero blog. So now would be a really good time for you to subscribe to the Vero newsletter linked below to get notified when that article comes out. Plus, in the newsletter, we always have lots of cool stuff like recipes and new wine releases that will come straight to your inbox. Now, until you read that article, if you are curious about tasting some wines made with native yeast fermentation, I recommend that you head over to the Vero shop on verovino.com, where you can find a whole host of wines made with native yeast fermentation to experiment with and see what you think. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something new. If you did, please leave a like below and let us know in the comments, have you tasted any wines fermented with native yeasts? Be sure to subscribe here on YouTube and to the Vero newsletter to never miss any more great content. And until next time, I will leave you with this video to continue. See you over there. Bye.